You're watching Yahoo Finance Live. I'm Julie Hyman. Thank you for joining us. Well, as we watch the coronavirus make its way across the United States and the globe, we also, of course, in the background have a lot going on in the world of politics, with just yesterday, President Barack Obama endorsing Joe Biden for president. We're joined now by a woman whose name has been talked about as a potential vice presidential pick. That is Stacey Abrams. She is Southern Economic Advancement Project founder and executive director. She was a gubernatorial candidate in Georgia as well as a state representative there. Stacey, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So there's an interview with you just out today in Elle magazine where you say, I would be happy to be the vice presidential pick, which is perhaps refreshing that you were frank about it when asked by the interviewer. As you know, you've been on a lot of lists here. First of all, I'm curious how important you think the vice presidential pick for Joe Biden is this cycle around, because as we know, he's 77, he's had some health issues. So do you think it's more important now, and why do you think you're the right person?
Well, first, I think that the health of the president is always important. And I think that Joe Biden is hale and hearty and ready to do this job. And when he is elected, will be capable of doing this job for the duration of his term. And I think that is why we as a party have rallied around him, because we believe he is capable of doing this job. And I think the vice presidential pick always matters. But I think there are two parts to it. There's winning the election, and then there's actually serving as lieutenant. I've been in a very awkward position of being asked this question since March of 2019. And one of my beliefs is that if you're asked a question, you answer it. And so I've tried to be very honest and transparent, and sometimes that's a bit off-putting. But as an African-American woman, as a woman of color, and as a person of color, I find it very problematic to reject the notion of opportunity to play into the sort of traditionalist notion of demurral, because I believe in diversity of leadership, and one has to be willing to say you're willing to serve. And I think that my mix of private sector, public sector, and nonprofit leadership prepares me to be able and capable of serving in that role if I am so honored.
Tracy, hi, Rick Newman here on the other side of the internet. You've heard the criticism that you may not be ready yet for this office because you haven't yet held a federal or a national job. What's your answer to that?
That is the wrong metric to use to determine who would be effective in this role. First and foremost, leadership and management experience does not simply come from being in federal office. That's why we have elected folks who have not been in federal office. But more importantly, what we need in this moment is someone who can help rally the communities that we need to have engaged, who can help run an effective government. And I have done that. I have been an effective leader at every level of government. I may not have been in the federal level as an elected official, but I've developed an 18-state network that has worked with local, state, and federal leaders to build the strongest voter protection apparatus this country has seen. And I believe that those are transferable skills. But more than anything, I know that I possess the intellectual capacity and the intellectual curiosity to be an effective leader. I work well across the aisle, and I work well with all of our folks in our communities. And so I believe I would be a strong leader and would be more than capable of doing this job.
Stacey, it's Adam Shapiro, and thank you for giving us permission to address you by your first name. You are quite accomplished when I look at your bio, and you did study public policy at the University of Texas, and never before has public policy been so urgently needed in the United States. So help us understand how you will connect with people who don't know you from Georgia in the middle of the country, because now more than ever, we need that leadership on public policy.
Absolutely. I think there are three things. One is that my work has not been solely limited to Georgia. And I think it's important to understand that in Georgia, we have a part-time legislature, which means that I've had to make a living and build community, build companies while I was serving in the legislature. I was extraordinarily successful as Democratic leader, but I was also a very effective small business owner, and I was a very effective nonprofit leader. Since I did not become governor, I've traveled this country. I've been to more than 25 states, working with leaders in every one of those states, and we turn out hundreds, if not thousands of people to come and participate. But to your point about actually thinking about the administration of government, I was a bureaucrat before I ran for office. I worked in government. I had to think about how do you take the laws passed by well-intentioned legislators and turn it into the active work of running a government. I worked with one of the most fantastic mayors in the country, but more than that, I've spent my adult life learning and practicing this work. And so I come at it from someone who's had the experience of working not only in government, but understanding how government works with others. I've come at it as someone who has intentionally developed a foreign policy background that is, I would say, fairly strong for someone who has not been in the Senate or in foreign service. But most of all, I bring to it the ability to work across the aisle and to work across communities. And that, I think, are the three things we need heading into this next administration.
Stacey, what is your faith in the political process at this point? Because you have your own experience in Georgia and a contested election there. You have what we just saw happen in Wisconsin. And then, of course, we have the election in the fall. And there have been a lot of questions about how that election is going to be conducted. So are you concerned at all?
Well, I believe in the trust but verify approach to politics, which is that we have a democratic system that is capable of withstanding the travails of a pandemic. But we have to have the willingness to acknowledge our flaws and the work that we have to put in to fix those mistakes. One of the reasons in my 2018 campaign, I acknowledged the legal legitimacy of my opponent's victory, but still challenged the system, is that we have to be willing to do both. We can have an election that is fair and that is accurate, but we have to do the work to make it so. That's why I believe the next CARES package has to include funding for our states to move to more vote by mail, not because we can replace in-person voting, but because our responsibility is to make it as safe and accessible as possible. That means getting as many people out of line as we can so that those who need to be in line can do so safely. And that can only happen if our federal government invests in our states today so they can plan for, prepare for, and execute safe and effective elections in November.
Stacey, there are some Democrats who are very worried that the Trump administration and perhaps some Republican governors or Republican state officials allied with Trump could actually cheat in the November elections. Is that a realistic concern? And if it is, how would that happen? What would it look like if Republicans would try to, whether it would be try to deny Democratic votes or pump up Republican votes? I mean, what are the real vulnerabilities here?
Voter suppression has three effects, or has three pieces. First, it's can you register and stay on the rolls? And so we have seen attempts unfortunately in recent years, by Republicans to limit who has access to actually getting registered and staying on the rolls. And it's why we also have seen an aggressive, we've seen more aggressive voter purges across the battleground states. And so we have to make certain that people can get on the rolls and stay on the rolls, especially during a time when getting back on the rolls is almost impossible because people can't get to our county clerk's offices, and not every state has online registration. The second is, can you have access to a ballot? That's why voting by mail is so critical, because we need to make certain as many people as possible can access their ballots without putting their lives at risk, which is what we saw happen in Wisconsin last week. And then the third is making sure those ballots get counted. We know that there are certain states that have higher levels of rejection rates for absentee ballots for people of color and for communities that are considered undesirable. And so the best way to ensure a fair and accurate election is to ensure that as many eligible voters can participate as possible, that we remove as many barriers as we can and remain safe and secure, and that we acknowledge that voter fraud is almost non-existent in this country. Almost every example of voter fraud is by and large attributable either to confusion or to mistakes. And so we should not be focused on the false worry of voter fraud, which in fact, President Trump had to dispel when he disbanded his voter fraud commission. The issue is voter access, and that is something we can do together. I don't think people are going to, by and large, cheat, but I do think using voter suppression is a way to silence the voices and to steal the election from those who should be able to participate. And if we as a nation say that we want as many eligible voters as possible to participate, then we will have a safe and secure election.
Stacey, I want to pivot a bit and talk about what's happening there in the South right now. Because again, you are the founder and executive director of the Southern Economic Advancement Project. There has been a lot of talk about how the South is more vulnerable in some ways to this coronavirus pandemic, both health-wise and economically. What are you seeing, and what actions are being taken on the ground to try to address some of that?
The CARES package that came out a few weeks ago was an important start to responding to COVID-19. But what we have to understand is that in the South, we have the most vulnerable and the least resilient populations. We tend to have lower levels of public benefits. Even though we have more people who rely on them, the amount they receive from those public benefits tend to be less than in other regions of the country. We have a lower rate of people who have access to paid sick leave. And because by and large, we have service-based economies, these tend to be lower paid workers who are the most easily removed from their jobs or have their jobs disrupted. And so the challenge we are facing is that we have all of these constraints and we do not have the security of a public health system that can withstand it. Part of the challenge in the South is that half of the states that have refused to expand Medicaid are southern states. That means that not only are you at greater risk of exposure, you have less opportunity to be tested and to be treated. We have seen more rural hospitals shut down, and that cuts across race. But we also know there are racial implications to the systemic inequities that exist in our cities and in our communities in our states in the South. The solution is three things. One, we need to increase and dramatically reinvest in those public benefits. For example, unemployment insurance is very low paid in the South. And so while the $600 that has been added is important, we have a lot of folks who simply can't qualify because of how the rules have changed for access to unemployment benefits. Number two, we have the healthcare crisis of not having enough doctors and enough hospital beds. And I live in a state where the fourth highest rate of coronavirus, the fourth highest coronavirus rate is in Albany, Georgia. And that's the fourth highest in the world. That is endemic, and that is absolutely demonstrative of why we need a stronger public health system and why we need southern states to expand Medicaid now. And lastly, we need to recognize that for millions of Americans, especially those in the South, they will not receive the guaranteed $1,200 stimulus check because they're unbanked and because they're outside of some of the economic systems that we're relying on. There are a lot of them who do not have to file taxes because they make so little money. That means they will not automatically receive the resources they need when they are the most vulnerable at this moment.
Stacey, I'm curious, could you bring up the Medicaid expansion in Georgia? And the governor there proposed in November a kind of half-hearted expansion with conditions. You had to be fully employed or you had to be in school. And what strikes me in this crisis is if someone has coronavirus, whether they're employed or in school, doesn't matter. They're still they can get the rest of us sick. So has the governor there listened to these pleas about you really should expand Medicaid to this kind of system, or is it still in traction?
Unfortunately, there's been no movement, and it is unfathomable to me why that would be so. This is not a partisan issue. Republican governors, Mike Pence expanded Medicaid. The state of Kentucky expanded Medicaid. So this is not a partisan issue. This is an issue of morality. And unfortunately, the current governor of Georgia does not believe that access to healthcare should belong to those who are in need. And what he is also ignoring is the likelihood of transmission, because people who may be asymptomatic and have to go to the poultry processing plant to work, or who are in essential service working jobs, because Georgia's number one industry is agriculture. We have a lot of essential farm workers who cannot get access to the healthcare they need and cannot prevent themselves from spreading the disease. Expansion of Medicaid could solve problems and save lives. And it's also a gateway to economic recovery, because in the states that have expanded Medicaid, they've seen their cost of healthcare go down. They've seen the numbers of jobs expand. And most importantly, new jobs come to places where healthcare is possible. And so I do not understand the recalcitrance of the current governor, but I can tell you that one of the best solutions for the 7 states in the South and for the 14 states in the nation who want to survive and thrive after this crisis is over is expansion of Medicaid.
Stacey, I wonder if before you go, you could just give our audience some idea where you stand on the Democratic spectrum. Do you support Bernie Sanders style Medicare for all and eliminating private insurance, or do you lean more toward Medicare for more, but keep private insurance in place?
Well, I live in a state where we're trying to get Medicaid for some, so that's where I begin my political beliefs. But here's where I am. I'm a pragmatic progressive. I grew up in and live in the South, and I understand the necessity of having the broadest vision possible for what we should do, but understanding the necessity of getting to where we can get these things done. I support private insurance. I think that we have to make certain that people have the options that they need, and that those options have to be reflected by the realities of where they live. I live in the South, and there are simply some ideas that are unfathomable because they cannot be put in place because of the structural inequities and just the structural differences of where we live. One of the reasons I am so excited about Joe Biden is that he has always believed in moving forward, but he understands that there are moments where we have to pause to let people catch up. You can move so far ahead that no one can see you, which means they can't follow. And so my belief is that I want to see us make progress from where we are, but we have to understand that we have 50 states in very different places. That's why I've focused so heavily on fair fight, making sure that everyone has the right to vote and therefore say the future they want to see, that we have fair count, which is working to make sure that the census is in place and that hard to count communities are being reached across the country, because we have to be able to access the $1.5 trillion that gets allocated, but also the political power that will be redistributed in 2021. And why I founded SEEP, because I know that in the South, if we can solve the economic crises that we face in the South, if we can build the type of equity possible, then we can do that for America. And so I'm a Southern progressive, meaning I know where I start, but I know where we should end up.
Stacey Abrams, thank you so much for your time for us today. We really appreciate it. As Stacey mentioned, she founded SEEP, the Southern Economic Advancement Project. She is joining us from Georgia, I believe. And be well, Stacey. Thank you so much. Again,
thank you all.
Appreciate it.
Take care.